Good evening and welcome to episode 9 of ListenIn. About 9 weeks ago at Sunaparanta, we joined our forces together with many of our friends and creative force fields across the world to bring together different minds and conversations across fields from urban planning to conservation, from architecture to visual arts and photography, and of course, history. It is our pleasure today to introduce Professor Ruth Vanita, an academic and author and a strong advocate for the women's movement in India. Ruth is known for her pioneering work on gender and sexuality. She examines and challenges social and behavioral constructions of sexuality, exploring how romantic relationships have been represented in history, literature, or mythology, and how societies reacted to such attachments. Among her many books, SameSex Love in India, that she co-authored, is regarded as a seminal text and foundational work in gay and lesbian studies in the Indian context. Memory of Light is her first book of fiction that has just been released, and we'll be hearing more about it, hopefully, in this session. Ruth is a professor of English at the University of Montana and was the founding co-editor of Manushi, India's first nationwide feminist journal. This evening's session, Friendship, Same-Sex Love, and Marriage in the Indian literary tradition, begins with a presentation where she will illustrate how pre-colonial Indian societies and cultures cherished love and had different constructions of affection and desire. Ruth, can I hand this over to you?
Thank you. Most of what I say today is basically, I'm touching the tip of the iceberg because it's a huge topic. My remarks are based on this book, Same-Sex Love in India, and on this book, Love's Right. This one is just being reissued, updated version is being reissued, and this one, the updated version is ready, but if there is demand from readers, they will reissue it. And I'll come back to this later. Okay, so the first basic point I want to make is that, which I also made in Same-Sex Love in India, that in my view, in ancient Indian literature, friendship is the most important relationship, friendship of all kinds. It's an overarching relationship. Friendship between the gods and the humans is a major theme in the Vedas. Conversation and the Upanishads and the epics unfold through conversation between different beings, between humans and animals, between humans and humans, humans and gods, conversation between different types of friends. Also in other texts like the Panchatantra, the Katha Sagar, you have the same kind of pattern. So these friends could be teacher and student, but need not be. There is no clear dividing line between what we today, the way we completely distinguish love from friendship. That is not the case in most pre-modern societies. I've argued in Love's Right that in ancient Indian texts, marriage is a type of friendship. And when I say ancient Indian texts, it continues to be a tradition later in modern India as well. Marriage is a type of friendship, and friendship is a type of marriage. For instance, famously, taking 7 steps together or speaking 7 words together is supposed to constitute friendship. And in the vows of marriage also, that is what you do. You take 7 steps together, the Saptapadi, and say 7 shlokas together. Similarly, and this is again not unique to India. Aristotle also said that marriage is a type of friendship. Friendship too is a type of marriage. So there are occasions in the ancient texts where 2 men walk around a fire together to establish a friendship. And most important, friendship is seen as a very important and life-defining relationship. It's not just somebody you go out and have coffee with, is not a friend. It's basically, you can have only 1 or 2 friends in life because true friends are inseparable. They share everything. They eat together, they live together, they die together, they die for each other. One friend dies, the other friend then kills himself. That also is found in ancient texts. There are many, and one of the explanations for friendship and for any kind of love, when I said there's no clear dividing line between friendship and love, one of the points here is that this is explained as, and this explanation continues today, that when you inexplicably are drawn to or attracted to someone, this is, or when you inexplicably take an aversion to someone too, an affection that arises in the heart without a cause speaks of love that is persisting from a former birth. And this is repeated many times in the text, in different texts, and is a generally understood idea. Okay, and this continues in modern Indian cinema, for example, which is a unique feature of modern Indian cinema, very different from any other cinema. What I call romantic friendship, a friendship which is the most important relationship in the film. So both the men may have, and this is mostly shown in cinema between men, though in ancient texts it's also between women. The two men may have wives, may have girlfriends, but at the same time, the life-defining relationship for which they live and die is between them, and they sing songs to each other and so on. This is disappearing now with the anxiety that this could be read as homosexual, but I think it's a very, very important and Indic feature of Bombay cinema. And there are lots of examples of this that I won't go into because I don't have time. The second point to come to desire or love is that karma or desire is not a bad thing in Hindu philosophy. We first have to understand that karma, as we know, is one of the 4 aims of life. Desire is also a god, and this image here, by the way, is copyrighted. It's from by permission of the Seattle Asian Art Museum. I just want to acknowledge that because it's the frontispiece in my book, Love's Right. So desire is one of the 4 aims of life. Desire, not necessarily only sexual desire. Desire includes all kinds of desires. So in the Kama Sutra, there are 64 types of pleasures that they say everyone should be conversant with. And these include all the arts like flower arrangement, painting, cosmetics, perfumes. One should have knowledge of all these, yeah? So Kama is one of the 4 aims of life, and desire, Kama is also, of course, a god, Kamadeva. And then we all know about how the gods themselves and the divine itself in everything has all traits. So most famous image is Ardhanarishwar, but many other examples can be given. There are different interpretations you can give of this image. That's an ancient image, that's the modern version. You can see it as the fusion of husband and wife, of Shiva and Parvati. You can see philosophically that all existence is a combination of Prakriti and Purusha. It can be read as the bisexuality of all beings and the masculine and feminine tendencies in all beings. And as we know, when you say worship Shiva or Vishnu or the goddess, you worship them as everything, the best of mountains, the best of rivers, the best of male tendencies, the best of females. So they're both male, female, and neuter. And all of these, I think all of these interpretations, one doesn't cancel out the other. They're all true at the same time. Okay, so sex of all kinds is, and this is separate from the idea of friendship, but sex of all kinds is also depicted in ancient Indian art, as we know. These are little friezes from the famous ones from this is a male-female couple. So all kinds of sex is depicted in, at temples like Khajuraho, but not only Khajuraho, other places as well. And I just want to point out that these, when you look just at the picture like this, okay, it looks like you are, if you blow this up and focus on it, but that it looks different. When you actually look at it in the temple, it is part of the overall universe, or what one could call Vishwaroop. Everything is going on in the world, in the cosmos. So everything from making water, making love, to playing music, to animals, humans, Gandharvas, gods, everything is on the temple. It's the vibrancy of the entire universe. And you have to go very close to see these particular friezes, but there are all kinds of things going on there. It's not as if there's a focus on this. It's just one of so many things going on there. And when you as you approach the temple, this is what you see. So you don't really see these friezes. You just get the sense of the vibrancy of the cosmos. And again, when you are still further back, you see many temples. You see the whole complex. So it's part of the world is what I'm saying. Just to give you one example quickly, don't have much time, but from these, this was one of my discoveries that I wrote about in both the books, SameSex Love in India and in Love's Right, is about these 14th century texts in Bengal, both Bengali and Sanskrit, in which a child is born from 2 women's intercourse by divine bliss. So I'll just quickly go through those slides again. These are the 2 books I was referring to. One book, this is one book. These are this is what I said about friendship. Yeah, this is the quotation about the origins of affection. These were just the images from movies. This is Kama or desire. This is the Ardhanarishwara. These are some of the phrases from the Kama Sutra. So no, not Kama Sutra, from Khajuraho. And this is how you see it as you approach the temple, as you're further away, and as you're still further away. Okay. So now to come to these 14th century Bengali texts, They are based on a first century medical text in which it says that if two women have intercourse and somehow one becomes pregnant, a boneless child will be the result. And these 14th century texts show this happening. And this is a very unusual text. They're not found I haven't found them in other languages, and I haven't found them, in fact, anywhere in the world about two women making love and producing a child physically. So I've written about this in both Same-Sex Love in India and in Love's Right. And here you see the romantic description of the two women getting together. Okay, to come to medieval India, which Salim Kidwai has written about in Same-Sex Love in India, here you have these all kinds of relationships. So you have long-term relationships written about here, some of which are mystical in nature and some of which are not mystical. They're just two people who are living together and one inherits the other's property. This is a mystical relationship that appears in Same-Sex Love in India. And this is casual relationships in the city where men of all kinds across classes, etc., are meeting each other in the city. Yeah. So you have lots of descriptions of this kind, both in prose and poetry in medieval India, in Persian, in Urdu. And then to come to the 18th century poetry that I have written about, both in my novel Memory of Light, which is the new novel, and also in my book, 2012 book, Gender, Sex and the City, which is when I researched this. Now, these are some of the names of the poets who wrote in this kind of poetry. And in this poetry, the most interesting thing I found, this is late 18th, early 19th century, before colonial rule proper, before 1857. The British are present in India, but Indian culture continues in the courts and the cities. The British have political and economic power, but they haven't taken over the education system, the administration. So culture continues in its own way, a hybrid culture with British influence as well. But the most interesting thing I found is the way that love is written about. The poets openly write, and these are major poets, and the way they openly write about love between women, love between men, and love between women and men, all in the same tones. So the tones vary from romantic to humorous to playful to serious to sad, but very much in the same way. And also the other interesting thing is the number of words for women's female lovers, for men's male lovers, for sex between women, etc. So Zalaki, for example, is one of the words for a woman's female lover. These are my translations from this book, Gender, Sex and the City. So here you can see examples of a very funny and playful approach to this love, where she says, "Nahak nahak mujhe jalati kyun hai, ghar mein mere aag lene aati kyun hai, आई तू तो नहीं ठहरती ये रंजिश है, बेफायदा यहाँ तू आती जाती क्यों है." So she feels attractions, but wonders why the neighbor woman is not interested at all, or is just not noticing it. The other interesting, this is a discovery that I made, and this is the descriptions of rituals that women performed to form couples between themselves. Now, these women could have been already married to men, because it says that when they marry another woman, it's among their female companions. So it is, they might be married to men already, and men, of course, many of them were polygamous at the time, both Hindu and Muslim. So also many of these women may have been courtesans who were different from sex workers, but courtesans lived in matrilineal households and were very central to the literary and intellectual culture of the cities like Lucknow, Delhi, Agra, Hyderabad, etc. And here you see a description of the ritual that they formed and the poet who's writing this in prose actually uses the word shadi. He says they get married among their female companions, and then they are called each other's ilaichi. So my novel, which has just appeared from Penguin, is a novel about intense love between two women, Nafis, a poet, and Chapla, a dancer. And the story is told by Nafis, remembering her youth. And it also depicts the cosmopolitan world of 18th century Lucknow. What I was basically trying to do is to explore what a pre-colonial culture looked like, because in same-sex love in India, we argued, and this is an idea I have also talked about in other books, is that modern homophobia in its modern form is an import from the West, and an import from the West that happens mostly after 1857. In other words, in the West at this time, I'll just get to that. Now see, this is one of the poets, the poet whose poetry I have been showing you, and this is one of his poems about a man speaking to men. And you can clearly see he talks very openly to a man. Jaan nikle hai o miya de dal, aaj wada na tal bose ka. Bosa means a kiss, and he's one man speaking to another, asking for a kiss. Yeah. At the very same time, so basically you can see the dates here. At the very same time, Lord Byron, who was a poet in England, when he wrote to women, he wrote openly, but when he wrote to men, he changed the pronouns from he to she for publication. It's very clear from his letters that he fell in love with both men and women, but much more intensely with men, in fact. And here, for instance, when he writes to a love poem to a man, he uses ours, I, you, so that the gender is unclear. Whereas Insha has no such inhibitions, Insha and many other poets of the time. So what this shows you is that when the British came to India, they were shocked by the kinds of sexuality or sexual institutions they saw in India, whether these were courtesans or polygamy or polyandry or same-sex relationships. They found the whole thing very shocking. And some of them really enjoyed the shock, and but others did not. And in the Victorian period after 1857, what happens is when the British control now the legal system, the educational system, the administrative system, that all of this poetry basically disappears from print, goes underground. I copied it out and translated it from manuscripts. Here's an example of a manuscript that was almost lost, and all this poetry, a lot of it has disappeared. So here's an example of a manuscript that almost disappeared but was saved at the last moment, because this poetry came to be considered obscene. Not just the ones about same-sex, but any kind of sexual poetry. And hence the tendency in the 20th century to talk about ghazals as being purely mystical, whereas in fact the ghazals of this time are very much about everyday life as well. They're about happy love, they're about friendship, they're about shopping, they're about jewelry, they're about fabrics, and it's nothing like the mystical ghazal you hear, which is all about unhappy love. So those mystical ghazals about unhappy love, of course, were written, but there were also these other ghazals which were very popular. Okay, and you can see the change in 100 years that happens. So in the 1820s, poets like Insha are openly writing about love between men, between women and men, between courtesans and men, everything. But by the 1920s, when the Hindi writer Ugra, he published these short stories about homosexuality called Chocolate, which I have translated, published by Oxford University Press. He was condemned by most other writers who all said this topic should never be written about. So basically the idea that homosexuality is unspeakable, it used to be called in Europe the sin not to be named among Christians. And in Europe, of course, up to the 19th century, early 19th century, men were being, and women too, but more men, especially in England, were being tortured, imprisoned, killed for homosexual relations. And you all know the famous case of Oscar Wilde by the end of the 19th century, where he wasn't killed, but he was put in prison, which resulted in his death because the conditions were so terrible. Whereas in India, there was no history of such, of anybody being killed for homosexuality. So, but in 100 years, the change in literary attitudes, where what was always speakable, always discussable, always debated, now becomes totally unspeakable. I forgot to mention that in the Kama Sutra, there is a whole chapter about men desiring men, which is very explicit. So anyway, to quickly come to Love's Right, which, as I said, is going to be reissued by Penguin. And it now has the new updated version has a whole list of all the cases I have been able to find of this phenomenon since the 1980s. The first one is in 1980, of young women from all over the country either getting married by religious rights to each other or committing joint suicide, or both. Sometimes they first get married by garlanding each other, putting sindoor in a temple, and then commit joint suicide. And I was collecting these reports, newspaper reports, and of course what I have is not at all complete. It's only what I could find since 1980. And the most interesting thing to me was two interesting things. One was, why did they pick who are these young women? So these women are mostly lower income group women, non-English speaking women. Jaya and Tanuja, the ones I'm showing you now, are an exception because they were nurses and they were more educated. Many of these other women were factory workers, fisher women, tribals, Dalits, there are Muslims, there are Hindus, there are Christians, and they're all over the country. These reports are from all over the country. That's one interesting thing. And they had no notion, they didn't even know any word like gay or lesbian. They were not connected to any movement. And this is before the international movement for marriage equality started, much before. So why did they pick this language of marriage and of death? The other interesting thing was that in many cases, several cases, the families first opposed the relationship, of course, but when they found the women were determined, then the families came around and actually celebrated the marriage. And that's why I showed the picture of Jaya and Tanuja, whose families actually arranged them, celebrated their marriage and had 200 guests, and where the two women were married to each other by a priest, and at the same time, one of their sisters married a man. So it was a double wedding. It was seen as a wedding, though of course the government, the registrar refused to register the marriage, but it was in the community, it was accepted. So that's a very interesting thing. Why did the families, those families who did accept, why did they accept? Of course, other families violently opposed them and drove them to suicide often. But again, the phenomenon of joint suicide is, I think, fairly unique to Asia. You don't come across joint suicide of this type in the West, at least not on any large scale. Individual suicide, of course, but not joint suicide. So I wanted to explore all these, and I wanted to explore the history of this type of depiction of socially disapproved marriages. I found 11th century cases of cross-jati, cross-varna marriages where the two threaten to commit joint suicide, then the parents come around and celebrate the wedding and things like that. So I was very interested in this language of marriage and the language of death, and that's what the book explores in terms of Indian laws, both Hindu and Muslim laws, and in terms of literary depiction and cinematic depiction, which made this language of marriage and death understandable to their communities, that their communities could understand what they were saying. So these women didn't use any word like saying we are this or that. There's no identity category. They don't say we are lesbians or we are anything. They don't even know those words. But they just say we are in love and we want to get married. And if you don't let us get married, they often say we'll kill each other, kill ourselves. And very often they leave suicide notes saying, please bury us together or cremate us together. And if we can't be married in this life, we'll be married in the next life. So I also am interested in what various people said. In 1993, Swami Bodhananda, who conducted the marriage of two men in Delhi, his explanation, this was his explanation of it, and this is the marriage. These are the two men today. When 377 was abolished, Sri Ravi Shankar said, and quite correctly, there are male and female elements in every being. Sometimes one is dominant, sometimes the other, and homosexuality has never been considered a crime in Hindu culture. There was this wedding of two women in the year 2000. There have been many such weddings, but I interviewed the priest who conducted the wedding, and he said many things. But one of the things he said is that marriage is a union of spirits. And of course, the Atman, the spirit, and in most religions, the spirit is not considered either male or female. So if it's a union of spirits, then why not this? He thought about it, and this is what he came up with. Another explanation given by many priests as well as ordinary people has been that if two people are so attached to each other, despite all the social disapproval, then they must be connected in a form of birth. This explanation I have found in ancient texts, and I've found in modern 20th century newspaper reports. So all of this is very interesting, and that's what the book is about. I guess I think I'll stop there maybe. And then after questions, if there's time, I will read an excerpt from the novel, and maybe I'll just close with a short couplet from Gender, Sex and the City. This is a Urdu शेर by Jan Sahab. खुदा के प्यारे हैं सीधे भी और टेढ़े भी, जो एक तीर को बख्शा है तो एक कमान को शर्फ. Dear to God are both the straight and the bent. He has given the arrow one honor and the bow another. Okay, so this idea of the straight and the bent is a very interesting one, because in early 20th century English, bent was a slang word for homosexual. I'm not sure if that is the case in Hindi or Urdu or not, but anyway, what he's saying is that different types of people, some who go along a straight path and some who take a different path, both of them are dear to God, just as you need both the bow and the arrow to shoot. So I think it's a rather lovely metaphor.
Thank you, Ruth, for that wonderful overview of same-sex love. I'm very curious, Ruth, love is a subject that is actually very often ignored or discounted, but yet you've made it the center of your research and your work. Could you let us know why? Elaborate.
Well, I don't know what you mean by discounted. Maybe in scholarship, it's not given much as much attention as some other themes. But in life and in cinema and in literature, it's certainly been love and death are the two great themes, I think, which are universal, cross-cultural, and found in every literature as a major theme. So there's nothing to have a love story. A love story is perhaps the story that everyone can tell. So it's only a question of how it is, the setting, the characters, how the love unfolds, and the differences in different societies of what happens. But love itself is the great theme that almost every great writer has written about, of some kind, love of some kind. It could be love for God, but it's still love. Yeah.
You've produced a critical vocabulary that is referencing either Indian literature, English literature, popular culture, cinema, to show us how our societies have been both homoerotic and heteroerotic. Do you think attitudes have changed today? Are people more sensitive and tolerant?
In a huge country like India, one cannot generalize about attitudes. So everything I said about attitudes changing applies basically to the Western educated. And as that group keeps, and those are the people who write, the ones who are educated are the ones who write. So even those who are educated in, say, Hindi or Tamil or whatever, they usually have contact with English as well. They know some English. And so it's their attitudes which change, and their attitudes change public attitudes, those that are expressed in the media. But that doesn't mean that every single person's attitude in the country changes. And hence my interest in this question of when these women, young women who are sort of outside the English-speaking world, when they get married, why is it that some families accept it after a while and even celebrate the marriage? And that's very interesting. It means attitudes have not entirely changed. The older traditions still continue. And I quoted the gurus to show you that the gurus, much before, they who were studying the text, they continued, some of them, not all of them, some of them were very homophobic as well, but some of them continue to see that if you think about it, yes, the gender doesn't have any spirit, and why shouldn't two people get married? So you still have in many spheres those attitudes continuing. And today in the public English educated sphere, yes, for sure, attitudes have changed in the media, in literature, etc., and has made a very big impact on the country. Again, it doesn't mean that everyone has changed their attitudes positively. There are plenty of people who are negative, but yes, you can see in the last 20 years a shift in attitudes, even in the political party. Every political party has shifted towards, for instance, from earlier saying no 377 should remain, now they all were in favor of abolishing it, right? So the attitudes have definitely shifted in when it comes down to your own family, when your own child wants to say that they are gay or they want to marry someone same sex, then very often families who are very liberal otherwise will still have problems, not always, but often they will. But I find that usually the families come around even after that in India.
Now, as women, because you've been very much part of the women's movement here in the country, as we grow up, we tend to be conditioned to, feel shame of our body, shame of our sexuality, our sexual fluidity. How do you address this aspect of shame in your work?
I think that there is a point, some anthropologists make a distinction between shame and guilt cultures, and I think there's a point to that. There are problems with that formulation, but there's still a point to it, which is that I think India is more of a shame than a guilt culture, and that's a very important distinction. So while you don't want something to be known, because what will people say is always a consideration, so you feel ashamed of people. And this is not just about homosexuality. It's in fact as much about males and females having any kinds of relations, or in some cases even being seen together in public before marriage. Yeah. So there is, yes, shame, but I don't think there is guilt in the same way, not in the same way as there is in some other societies, because there's no real Indian word, in a Hindi word at least, for guilt. Hindi or Urdu, no Hindi word for guilt, or Sanskrit word really, that's an exact equivalent. By which what that means is that in private, instead of agonizing about it and therapizing, in private, a lot of people do whatever they want to do. And some historians have written about this, that men having erotic games with men, it's considered just masti, as long as it doesn't get in the way of their continuing to function, have marriage, children, work. What men are doing with men or with women or whoever, between men and women, you don't want it to happen because of the danger of pregnancy, and but otherwise between men and men, women and women, what they're doing in private doesn't matter. But it's when it comes in the way of marriage, when they say, we want to marry each other and we don't want to get married to the opposite sex, or then it's when it becomes public, then it becomes shaming because the family doesn't want other people to know. And that is, yes, very hard to get over that. And as I said, I also think it's very interesting that there's a parallel between men and women, which is not there in the West. So in the West, it's fine for a man and woman to be seen holding hands in public. And in India, this is changing now, but mostly it is not. Fine. And so, for instance, the joint suicides that I mentioned, or the runaway marriages between women, this also happens between men and women. There's a whole history of men and women committing joint suicide together still going on, as well as running away and getting married in temples or by private rituals or whatever. So it's an exact parallel. And I think that's very important, which can be overlooked sometimes.
This aspect of guilt that you mentioned, I mean, there's still a lot of guilt, attached to pleasure, sexuality, fantasy. Do you feel that this guilt is produced as much by feminism as it is by mainstream culture?
I was actually saying the opposite. I was saying that it is shame. I mean, there are always exceptions when you generalize, but I was saying that in Indian culture, traditionally, there is more shame than guilt. It is not guilt. Guilt is when you feel, whether anybody knows or not, you feel terrible about it because God knows or you know or whatever, you feel terrible about it. I don't think that it is there to the same extent in Indian culture as it is in some other cultures. I think there's a great deal of shame, but not so much guilt. That was my point. And the point about and again, this is different for different families. And if you're very Western educated, English educated, the guilt may have come in as a great deal that has happened, but still overall, and this you can see from some of the magazine surveys that were done in the 80s and 90s, where percentages like 25% of people in a city or 18% of people in a city, anonymous surveys, said that they had had sexual relations with person of the same sex before marriage. And so clearly the guilt, if it was guilt, it didn't stop them. They just didn't want to make it public. Yeah. So that was the difference that I was pointing out. Yeah.
No, but I wanted to understand it from the point of view of a feminist perspective. Whether the guilt is actually produced by feminist ideas, so to speak.
Feminism is such a slippery word. There are as many feminisms as there are feminists. So feminists don't agree on anything, and they don't also agree that many times one feminist will think the other person is not feminist enough and should be called a feminist. So, applying these labels is kind of a futile exercise. I'm more interested in what people say and what people do. Action, the Gita starts with the word, what did they do? What they do is more important than what they call themselves, to me. And so it's not really, it's impossible to generalize and say, what does feminism do? It depends on the particular group of feminists, the particular individual feminists, what they're doing and what kind of attitudes they have. I can say this, that in the 80s, the women's movement did not mostly, though there were many lesbians in the women's movement, almost every group there were, but they didn't talk about it in public because they were afraid of this damaging the women's movement. And so it was a very silencing kind of an experience. But in the 90s, of course, from the 90s onwards, this gradually changed, and today it has changed in a major way.
You mentioned that there were a lot of lesbians that were part of the feminist movement. Is there a lesbian feminism, so to speak?
Well, I don't know. If you're a lesbian and you call yourself a feminist, then I suppose you can call that lesbian feminism.
But do you feel that, I'm
not sure that a heterosexual feminism would call themselves heterosexual feminism. So I don't know. It depends.
But in terms of feminism per se, would you say that it is limiting in the sense that it gets so caught up in trying to expose these oppressions of women that it doesn't really challenge masculine and feminist identities?
I can't generalize. There are millions of feminists, and one would have to discuss a particular situation and a particular group and a particular individual, and that's not a very useful exercise. So everybody is doing what seems best to them, and one can't generalize about what the effects it has. One can only do the work that one thinks is useful and illuminating. And if you don't like what a particular kind of feminism is doing, the best thing to do is not to criticize that, but just to do your own other work. In my view, that's the best. And I think this applies to everything. If you don't like what they're doing, do what you think should be done, instead of wasting your time criticizing them or being negative about them. Let everybody do what they think is best and see what the effects are.
When we look at gender, would you say that gender today is commodified? Is it linked to power relations? How can we understand this?
Everything is commodified in one sense, not just gender. Everything is commodified, almost everything. You teach in the university, you're kind of selling your brains. You have to teach what they want you to teach. You have to teach it in, there are constraints there. So everything is to some extent being bought and sold, but not entirely. You're not selling your entire brains. You're not selling every aspect of yourself. So in that way, yes, I'm not sure what you mean by gender is commodified, but if you mean gender, a beautiful person is shown in an ad and used to sell a commodity, yes, sure, that goes on. Or even to write a poem about somebody is you write a poem about a beautiful man, you're kind of, and then you're selling that poem. So you could call this commodification, but I'm not sure where that goes. Yeah.
And what role does the media play in destabilizing gender identities?
Well, the media is very open today in India, very open. India has a relatively free press, and following the nationalist movement, the media has always been fairly sympathetic to oppressed groups, and so has been a supporter of the women's movement, is now a supporter of the LGBT movement and many other movements. So media has played a big role, especially the TV talk shows, which very early on started in the 90s. They had talk shows about homosexuality, very sympathetic ones. Films, I think Bombay cinema has played an important role, like the Shumangal Zyada Savdhan, for example, is a culmination of many films that were leading up in that direction. Ishaqzade is another, not Ishaqzade, but Derish Kia is another example. So yeah, media has played a positive role in spreading ideas.
In terms of language, today we're using words like bisexual, genderqueer, which try to define who a person is attracted to, who they may seek intimacy from. My question is, do these words really fit? Do they have some kind of uneasiness?
Depends on you. If you think they fit you, you should use them. If you don't think they fit you, don't use them. The words are available. As you're talking about commodification, the words are available in the marketplace of words, and it's up to you to use them or not use them or invent your own words. And of course, this only applies to English, basically. So you have bad translations into other languages, but other languages have their own words, and that's part of my research. One of the things I'm trying to do in my work always is to find the words that people used about themselves, instead of trying to apply these words, whether feminist or bisexual or whatever, to past cultures. Try to find out what the words were that people used for themselves. And there are many words in many languages. So Swayamvara Sakhi is one word that I found in 11th century Sanskrit text for a woman whose friend is chosen by her herself. So Swayamvara Sakhi, and Swayamvara Sakha is also used for man choosing his male friend. Very interesting word. And then, as I said in Urdu, all of these words like Zanaki, Dogana, Ilaichi, Guiya, Urdu and Hindi, Chapti, etc. So there's a range of words, and I'm sure there's a lot of research to be done in other languages, which needs to be done to find out these words. And these are not identity categories necessarily, but they are describing relationships. And Indian literature is much more focused on relationships, I think, rather than individuals. Whereas English tends to be much more focused on defining yourself and research becoming me-search. You're constantly focused on yourself and trying to fit yourself into identities and come up with words for yourself. I think Indian literature is much more focused on relationship. And so it's about describing the relationships you have with people. When you say Swayamvara Sakhi, it's not about yourself primarily, it's about the person whom you have chosen. And I think that may be one basic difference between the two, which I've also written about. Yeah.
Memory of Light is your first nonfiction work. You mentioned it briefly during the presentation. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about it? Why it is a romance novel, a little bit more about the characters, how the relationships evolve?
Yes, it's a short novel set in the late 18th century in a kotha in Lucknow. And the narrator is Nafis Bai, who is in a courtesan family. And she falls in love with Chapla Bai, who is visiting from Banaras. And Chapla is a very glamorous dancer, and Nafis is a good poet and a sort of an intellectual. Courtesans were the female intellectuals of the time. So the story is about their love. The main story is their relationship, but around it, there are many other relationships. There's a relationship between a woman and a man. There's a relationship between men and men. There are friendships between, and I'm very interested in the non-sexual friendships between women and men that flourished in kotas. So there's her male friends. And I also have some historical characters, some of the poets like Insharangi, Jurat, etc., characters in the novel who are friends of her mother, and therefore also treat her as a little girl whom they know. So that's what the novel is about. And it's about love, it's about loss, it's about memory, it's about friendship, it's about motherhood. So she and the partner she ends up with has a baby. It's about courtesans lived in matrilineal households where the property and the skills were passed from women to other women, and where daughters were the desired child. And they were also, some of them were very prosperous women. They owned property, and so Nafis basically runs her household. She looks after she supervises the accounts and the finances and the budget, and all that's her work. So it's about a different time and place that I'm trying to imagine, and I sort of place the love story in a different world and see how when same-sex love doesn't have to face homophobia, it can still face other problems. There are still other problems and other obstacles that it faces in every society. And like, for instance, the problem of distance, which today we have different types of transport and communications at which they didn't have at the time. So if you go to another city, you're completely cut off and letters can take weeks to reach. So problems like it's not easy to get up and move for an individual in the 18th century, especially a woman. Today, you can sort of move to another city, even another country. At that time, you couldn't get away easily unless your whole family moved. You individually, it would be very difficult to move. So that's an obstacle. And there's always the obstacle of, in a love relationship, of one person loving more and the other loving less. And that's a problem that will always be there in love in any society. And so that's sort of a universal theme of writings about love. So, yeah.
I wanted to ask you, you said it in 18th century Lucknow. Is it because the period was culturally richer than other periods, or culturally more open in terms of romantic depictions of different kinds of relationships?
It's the one that I had researched. So I can't really make those sorts of claims. Hyderabad or Banaras or Delhi or other cities in the south might have been equally and differently rich or similarly rich. This is the one that I did the research on for my book, Gender, Sex and the City, and I had read a lot of the poetry and prose and translated it. So that world was alive in my mind. It was alive in my imagination, and that's the world in which I could set it. I don't know enough about I wanted to set it in a pre-colonial culture, and this is the pre-colonial culture I had done the work on, to know enough about it to be able to bring it to life. Yeah.
And you've incorporated stories from real poets. Would you like to tell us a little bit more and elaborate?
One of the real stories of the time was about a courtesan who fell in love with a male poet, and they have an ongoing relationship. The lady in charge of the quota discovers that this girl is only spending time with him and nobody else. Spending time, I mean, just as in conversing and so on, not necessarily having sex. And she really objects to it and says he's a very poor man, he's a poet, and we don't want this relationship. Then both of them pine and suffer and are almost dying. And then when they're almost dying, the lady relents and calls him back. It's a long poem written by Jurrat. And so I've made her a neighbor of the narrator and describe the story as a side story. So that's one of the real life stories from the time.
Do you like to read for us from the novel?
Yeah, I'll write. So this is when the two have gotten together after a long sort of courtship, you can call it. And okay, I'll just read briefly. Summer was at its height, and she sat behind me on the cool floor, arms wrapped around me, hair streaming over me, as we sang Rangeen Saab's new ghazal, in which a girl sang to a girl, and which we had made our special song. ज़नाखी की रंगत ए जवान और पीर सोने की, सरापा वो नजर आती है एक तस्वीर सोने की, किनारी गिर्द जो चेहरे की उसकी ज़ेब देती है, मुसव्विर जो कहती है तस्वीर की तहरीर सोने की, गले के हार तेरे हो रही हूँ ए लगा मैं, नहीं दरकार तुझको जाने मन जंजीर सोने की. My dearest has a youthful complexion like yellow gold. From head to foot she looks like a picture of gold. Her scarf's border frames and adorns her face. Her words shaped like calligraphy on a picture of gold. I've become the necklace round your neck, dear one, so my life, you don't need a chain of gold. Now her many moods were all for me. When she picked a fight and went away to her room to sulk, leaving me in despair, only to send a contrite note over and follow it next day. When she sat working on her poems, puffing at the hookah, our verses answered, completed each other, played on each other's names, hidden codes we thought that only we could decipher. Two nutshells concealing a joint kernel, twinned buds on one stem, milk and saffron, color in every drop. Or when I started up from our bed, hearing footsteps, and ran into the dressing room with her purple veil draped across my chest, and she followed, murmuring, "It looks like a coal cellar on you. Take it off. What do you want with an orni anyway, except to cover your head, a little thing like you?" "I want to smell it," I teased, holding it over my face and then dropping it to the floor and her onto it. When we argued over mangoes, an argument one can be sure of hearing in every home every summer, "Kashi's mangoes are much sweeter," she said, eyes dancing at me over the green-skinned one she was devouring. "Like honey, golden, and not stringy at all." "They're too sweet," I said. "Ours have a dash of sourness to set off the sweet." "Langras are rounder, they fit nicely into your hand." "You seem to be doing pretty well, fitting ours into your hand." "That's because I'm good at it. Watch." She picked up another and slowly began pressing a thumb and two fingers upwards from its base to its peak, her eyes transfixing mine. When she pinched off the end and began sucking, her wide mouth half smiling through the juices, I was thankful I'm not fair enough for a flush to be noticed.
Thank you. I'm just going to start with a few audience questions that we have. You've published an amazing amount of research on the subject. Did you find that the attraction for same-sex union, especially between females, was because of disillusionment or oppression in patriarchal society?
No, not at all. In the Rekhti poetry, the women in the Urdu poetry that I've been reading, for example, the women all have access to men and probably even many of them have relations with men as well, in my novel as well as in the poetry and the prose of the time. And same with the men. The men are almost all married and have children, but they have relations with each other. So it's about who you are attracted to. And in earlier societies, pre-colonial societies, people didn't think of gender as necessarily the primary reason you are attracted to someone. They thought of youth and beauty, or sometimes even old people you could be attracted to. They thought of it as taste that you have. And different people are attracted to different things, which doesn't mean that the attraction has to be exclusive. It could be, but it doesn't have to be exclusive. So it's not depicted in that way. It's just depicted as something that happens. It's a very different approach from today's approach. Yeah.
Why are we as society today so averse to homoeroticism and even heteroeroticism, when these are themes that have consistently existed throughout our history, text, and culture?
When I say we, again, one can't generalize about the whole country or the whole world, but I think today it's becoming more and more acceptable. Even in Indian cities, I see people across class and different groups, very different groups, including poor people, in malls and everywhere on streets holding hands, man and woman holding hands, which never used to be the case before. It would only be two men holding hands or two women holding hands. Now men and women also hold hands, I've noticed, in cities at least, in urban areas. I think it's becoming more acceptable in movies and on TV everywhere, and people dating, again, across class, pretty much meeting each other. They always did it, but now they're doing it sort of relatively more openly in urban areas, even in smaller towns. So yeah, having said that, I would say that the reason attitudes change, according to me, is because of British rule, basically. So British rule of a particular time at a particular place in Victorian rule. It was the British at that time were Victorian. They were not just any British. And they had all kinds of rules about covering up and dressing in certain ways. And for instance, a woman in England was not supposed to show her ankles in the 19th century. And so with those attitudes, when they came to India, they found a lot of things going on in India very shocking. And they had made laws to get rid of these things. For instance, they made laws which turned courtesans into sex workers. They didn't see any difference. They made laws which, of course, 1861, they made the section 377, which made homosexuality a criminal offense, which had not been earlier. So they made the laws to get rid of polygamy, get rid of polyandry. Gradually, over time, they got rid of matrilineal societies, and not just the British, then English-educated Indian nationalists also internalized these attitudes. So, and this is across the board, from the left, so-called left to the so-called right, and everything in between. One thing they agree on is that sex is to be heterosexual and monogamous within marriage, and that pleasure is not to be engaged in for its own sake. Basically, that work is the most important thing in life, and changing society is the most important thing in life. I think these attitudes still linger, and pleasure and play for their own sake are a frivolous and stupid thing. So, which was not the case in earlier societies. Pleasure and play, whether it's Leela or whether it's the idea of Leela, or whether it's the idea of why does Krishna do all the things he does? It's just his Leela. It's partly his Leela. It's play. And in Urdu poetry, the idea of bazi. So somebody does patang bazi, somebody does kaputar bazi. This is not to make money. Somebody does aurat bazi, somebody does londe bazi. So somebody does chapat bazi. So people are doing different things because they like to, and it's their taste, and it's for pleasure. And that's what life is. One of the aspects of life is kama, desire, pleasure, which is a good thing. This changes in Victorian England, where everything has to be earnest and solemn and serious, and everything you do, every book you write, everything you read has to be going towards some moral purpose. It has to be making society better. It has to be educational. And I think, unfortunately, we internalize these attitudes, and these have become dominant attitudes. Now, again, it is shifting, but these become the dominant attitudes, which is not to say that pleasure and play go away. They still remain, but you kind of try to hide them, or you try to say, even when you're having fun, you try to say, oh, this is because I'm for some good and educational and moral purpose and trying to change society and all this sort of thing. That becomes the excuse or the reason you have to give at every stage. As I said, it's changed today. I think it's changing today in the last 15, 20 years, or maybe a little more. But definitely this very didactic approach to things, I think, is a product of the colonial and post-colonial period.
Another participant wants to know if you could talk to us a little bit about how relationships are viewed in regards to transgenders. Are relationships politicized socially when a person in a relationship is transgender?
Well, in the period that I studied, which is this 18th century period, which in my novel too, I have characters. There are characters who are called Khaja Saras. They are men who were castrated but then they very often rose to become very, very important, very politically and economically powerful. And they dressed as men, they were treated as men, they had male names. And at the same time, they were hijras also. But it's very important that Khaja Saras are different. And there's one, for instance, famous nobleman, Almas Ali Khan, very, very famous at the time, the most important and powerful nobleman in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. He became. He owned huge amounts of land. And so he's a character in my novel as well. He was a friend of the poets. He made huge donations to mosques as well as temples. He was born a Hindu, but converted and castrated and became a Muslim, but remained in contact with his Hindu family. And he had many friends. He was very spiritual, also spiritually inclined, and he's a remarkable man, but he's not the only one. There were many other such Khaja Saras, and there are lots of stories about them. So there's that. And another kind of temporary transgendering, or some guy there's this lovely story about this guy called Banke Begum, which I've written about in the novel as well as in my Gender, Sex and the City, the book, where this guy, there was a lot of chain snatching and snatching of jewelry in the city. So what he did is he was a banker, which is a particular kind of formulation of a dandy, a young man who is a warrior kind of a figure, but also at the same time very interested in style and glamorous kind of a figure. This is an urban figure, the banker. The word persists in Indian cinema. So anyway, he dressed up as a woman and put on a lot of jewelry and sat in a palki with his hand hanging out of the palki with the bangles on his hand. And then the robbers come and kind of try to snatch it. Then he jumps out dressed in women's clothes and fights with them and defeats them all. So then he's called to the court at Delhi to be rewarded, and he goes in his women's dress. And so because he goes in his women's dress and receives the award, from that time on, he's known as Banke Begum. Okay, so he's a man. He doesn't change his body or anything, and but he's known as Banke Begum. So there's kind of a crossing of the gender line there. And he started going around in women's dress then, from that time onwards. But then when Nadir Shah's invasion took place, he died fighting Nadir Shah's soldiers. Okay, so he's occupying these different roles at the same time. He's taking what is a conventionally male role of fighting the soldiers, and he continues that. And he's also dressing as a woman, and he's also known as Banke Begum, but at the same time, he's known as a man as well. So this is this wonderful series of gender crossings, a story told by one of the poets.
Another question is, how would you respond to homo-populist tendencies of queer Hindu right-wing groups who use religious institutions like marriage, Hindu myths on same-sex tolerance, and so on to build a narrative of queer Hindu exclusionism that often borrows from patriarchal or homonormative understanding of gender and Islamophobic narrative of a pure Hindu nation? How does your work on early Indian sexualities emerge as a political critique of the same instead of influencing it?
I don't know what narrative you're referring to. I've never come across any such narrative which excludes the Islamic. I work on both. So obviously I work on Urdu texts and medieval Muslim, not medieval, but late 18th century Muslim and Urdu texts. And I also work in Sanskrit and on earlier texts. So and if you work only on one, say if you only work on no Sanskrit and work only on Sanskrit texts, it doesn't necessarily mean you're being exclusionary. It just means that you don't know anything about the other one. I had to teach myself Urdu to learn, to be able to read these texts. So yeah, but I don't know who specifically you're referring to, so I can't say.
Okay. We have time for one last question now. How would one start reading about these topics? Where could a complete novice start if one wants to read about Hindu scriptures and literature and
Well, if you want to read the scriptures, you can read them. They're all online. Everything is online in the original language and in English. Most major texts are. If you want to read on this particular topic, I would suggest starting with Same-Sex Love in India and Gender, Sex and the City and Love's Right. So Same-Sex Love in India is a basic text in which we have translated texts from about 15 Indian languages from over a period of 2,000 years. So we have taken out little bits from the text and translated them from Sanskrit, from Urdu, from Persian, from Hindi, from Bengali, from Marathi. So you can start there. It's a book which has just been released again, updated version. And then if you don't like to read nonfiction, you can read fiction. You can read you can read my book, Memory of Light, which will give you an insight into different types of love in the 18th century, and in a light form of light reading, where you don't have to read something that's scholarly and heavy. So it depends on who you are and what you're looking for. And there are many other books now out there as well.
All right, I have one last question, Ruth. Is the Indian academic circle today, do you think they're more open to producing literature on same-sex love as, say, 20 years ago?
Oh, definitely. When I was educated at Delhi University, the word was nothing about the subject was ever mentioned in class, even while teaching openly gay writers, gay writers who were known to be gay, like Foster or W.H. Auden. It was never mentioned. And that is why I started educating myself by reading both in Western literature. My first book was Same-Sex Love in the English Literary Imagination, where I wrote about English literature. And then I started educating myself by reading Indian texts, and as much as I could. Of course, I don't know all the languages, so but as much as I could. So, but now today, of course, in the academy, I would say it's very popular, even in some circles fashionable. It is, there are people doing research on it. There are people writing on it. I keep getting I often get emails from students asking me what they can research in it. And I always say to research in other Indian languages, for which you need to learn the Indian language if you don't know it well, or deepen your understanding of it, and then work in older literature. But unfortunately, I find most people want to work in English 20th century on texts that have been translated at most in Hindi, but not in other languages. I think there's a lot of scope to do work in other Indian languages. Just, let's say Telugu or Tamil. I think very little has been done, scholarly work on those languages. Assamese.
All right. And on that note, I want to thank you, Ruth, for your time. I know it's very early at your side, so have a good rest of the day, and thank you to our audience for listening in. Thank you.
Thanks for asking me.